Zuccaire Gallery. I'm Karen Levitov, the director, and it's really a pleasure to welcome you to the exhibition Printing Solidarity, Tricontinental Graphics from Cuba, and our first program of the spring semester. The exhibition is curated by 4 graduate students under the directorship of Professor Sohl Lee, and the students Sarah Meyer, Amy Khan, Daniel Menzo, thank you, and Elise Armani organized the exhibition, and today's program is sponsored by the Center for Korean Studies and the Art Department. I'll now turn it over to Sarah to introduce the panelists.
Thanks everyone for coming. Today we're going to have 3 speakers from the Art Department here at Stony Brook talking about the visual citations and references in the posters on display today. They'll be talking about how the Cuban artists that created these posters found the sources that they worked with, as well as print techniques of all the posters here. So I'll be introducing each speaker once one speaker is done. But to just review, we're going to be hearing from Barbara Frank, who's the professor in African and African diasporic art here at Stony Brook. Professor Sohl Lee, who is assistant professor in modern and contemporary East Asian art and helped with the curation of this exhibition. And Lorena Salcedo Watson, professor of practice and a master printer here at Stony Brook. So, welcome.
So I have 2 stories, essentially, that I'm going to tell today. One is a sort of a detective story that has to do with identifying the images in some of these posters. Back in November, Sohl Lee, Professor Lee, sent me a couple of these images and said, by any chance, could you identify the African objects that are in them? And this is sort of a story of African art history, very briefly, connoisseurship, and it's also a story of Google Images, Wikipedia, and Facebook, if you can believe it. And the other is, I'm going to end with a little bit more of a historical aspect of looking at that particular moment in time of the 1960s when these posters were made, which was an incredible period in Africa, heady days of independence and optimism and nation building. And the arts were very much at the center of that whole remarkable time. So, as I said, back in November, I received a text from Professor Lee with these 2 images. And I responded pretty quickly to say that the one on the left looked like a Baoulé sculpture from what is now Côte d'Ivoire, and the one on the right, a Lulua sculpture from Central Africa. And it's my training in the so-called classical or traditional arts of Africa that provided me with really a modest level of connoisseurship, such that I was able to make this assessment pretty quickly based on the style of these 2 figures, the way the artist handles the human form, and certain details such as the scarification marks, the accoutrements, leaving out the Kalashnikov rifle, and so forth. So my identification of the one as Baoulé and the other as Lulua very much reflects a dominant paradigm in the way African sculptural traditions have been treated and framed, the so-called one tribe, one style model. So this is a model that developed very much as the discipline of African art history developed out of anthropology, that means of categorizing and labeling African peoples. It grew very much out of colonialism and the process of colonial masters trying to figure out the diversity of peoples and how to control them. So part of that way of controlling them was to label them and to map them. And so this is very much comes out of that particular dominant paradigm. It was the objects that became part of World's fairs that were collected in the 19th century and early 20th century for World's fairs, for display at these fairs, then entered into collections of natural history museums, ethnographic collections that deemed themselves to be encyclopedic. And so again, the process of identifying and labeling people also extended to labeling objects and bringing them into collections and categorizing them as part of that process. And so the big collections of these art objects, what we now understand as art objects, came into the Trocadero Museum in Paris and ultimately became the Musée de l'Homme, into the Museum of Mankind that was part of the British Museum, into the Field Museum in Chicago, and so on. And this idea of mapping, and this is a map from an early exhibition catalog of the sculpture of Africa. And you can see the kind of oversimplification: Sudan, Guinea Coast, Congo, and then you have numbers attached to tribes that are on the map to give you an idea. And one thing you notice immediately is that in this context, African art means sculpture, masquerades from West Africa and Central Africa. So there's no recognition of the cultural diversity of the continent of Africa, the kinds of art forms we find in North Africa, in Egypt, in Eastern and Southern Africa. So in the development of the field of African art history, this particular moment meant masks and sculptures, mostly produced by men in West and Central Africa. So my first step was Google Image. And this actually yielded results almost immediately. Again, I had the knowledge to look for Lulua, and actually Lulua coming up ends up in some Japanese anime figure. So I had to put Bena Lulua, which means the people of the Lulua River. And this yielded the exact object. And so I know Professor Lee was very excited when I said, not only did I identify it, here's the exact object. But it's not quite the angle that was used by this Cuban artist. So this also led me to this particular image that I found on a Google image. Was actually from a Wikipedia page. And it has a very brief statement about the use of arts and the certain aspects of it. Very brief, not a lot of information. And here I just have a couple of other examples of Lulua sculptures. And some of the things that they share, the proportions of the body are similar. The attenuation of the forms is also very similar. And the presence of elaborate facial and body scarification marks, and particularly curvilinear ones. These are all sort of very characteristic of Lulua sculpture. So the search for the Baule figure was not as immediate or as successful using Google Image. And I bring up here, this is one of a pair of figures that are in the Metropolitan Museum that are considered classics in looking at Baule sculpture. At any rate, I looked through many of these. I didn't really see what I was looking for. So here's an example of a number of Baule sculptures. So I posted this on Facebook, that intellectual environment, and I would say about 2/3 of my Facebook besties are actually African art connoisseurs. So I posted this image of the poster, and I got all kinds of responses, and people pretty much agreed, oh yeah, that's Baule, no problem. And one of my colleagues, a retired curator, suggested that I reach out to this team, a father and son team, a collector and an archivist, a Belgian collector and archivist, that have assembled an incredible database. Oh, actually, I forgot to mention, this before I got to that point, as I was looking through all these images on Google image search, I came across this image, the one actually in the middle. And one thing I could say is that that image was probably an image of a piece that was carved by the same hand, by the same artist. The handling of the face, the particular way in which the hairstyle is done, and so forth. And I later found this other image on the right. So this is a piece that was in the ethnographic museum, the big ethnographic museum in Berlin. And so I also looked through their databases to see if the piece that I was looking for was in their collections, and to no avail. At any rate, my Facebook friend put me in touch with this database, African Heritage Documentation and Research Center. And it's a database that has something like 170,000 images that have been culled from exhibition catalogs, auction catalogs, their own private forays into museum collections and private collections. And it's really quite a remarkable resource. I had not been aware of it before that. So I wrote to him and I sent him the poster. And he, within 24 hours had sent me back the picture that was not only the picture of the actual object, it was the picture from the book that Cuban artist, Jesus, in Cuba, had to have used. So this gives you an idea. Without his help, it might have taken me a little while. So over 4,000 results for Baule figure in that database collection. So this was a piece that, again, the reference that he gave me was to this particular book, a book by Michel Leiris and Jacqueline Delange, published in 1968. It was translated into English. It's also translated, I believe, into Spanish as well. And so, turns out we have the French version in our library. I brought it in. I can show it to you afterwards. And so I went and checked it out and was able to find other images as well that are references. So in this text, this figure is simply identified as a commemorative figure. And when I first spoke to Professor Lee, I said that I thought the figure might be a spirit spouse or spirit lover. The Baule have a tradition of thinking of everyone having a soulmate in the spirit world. And sometimes that soulmate leaves us alone for our entire life, and sometimes that soulmate enters into our lives and disrupts our lives and our relationships with our human partners. And whenever that happens, whether it's inability to conceive, whether it's just not getting along, whatever that problem is, the idea is that you're not spending enough time and not giving enough attention to your spirit spouse. And so a man or a woman in this situation may have been told this by a diviner and may then go to a sculptor and commission a figure, and then that figure becomes their spirit spouse partner. And it lends to some convenience when maybe the woman doesn't particularly want to sleep with her husband that night. She'll say, no, I'm spending the night with my spirit lover, and so forth. So it's a wonderful way of dealing with certain common problems that everyone sometimes has. Well, then I found this image, and it is, you can see on the far left in this glass case, is that same figure. And it's much larger than these other figures. The spirit spouse figures tend to be about 10 to 12, maybe 15 inches high. But this figure, before it lost its legs, would have been much larger. And so this figure probably was one commissioned by a diviner. And in fact, that other figure that I think was made by the same hand, they might have actually been carved as a pair to be together. And diviners, trance diviners among the ballet will perform, they'll go into trance, provide communication with the spirit world, and part of their status as diviners is to have these sculptures which will be brought out and put on display during a session. So to go back to this figure now, as I mentioned before, I found the object, but I didn't find the photograph. And once I had the book, by way of identifying this ballet figure, I found that this was added to my presumption that Jesus Fortrans had one of the translations of this specific book that he was using the images from. Another example, this is not one of the posters on exhibit here, but it's one of Fortrans' posters. And this mask, Luba Kefuebe mask, formed the backdrop for this figure. I haven't yet identified the dancing figure, and that may come eventually. So, just to conclude here, these posters, they stand on their own as these fabulous images. And they speak to a particular moment in time of the 1960s. As I said, this was a time of incredible optimism and experimentation, nation building. Countries in Africa like Mali and other countries were trying to figure out how to position themselves at a time when the US and the Soviet Union were locked in a Cold War. And one of the ways, most of my own work has been in Mali. And one of the ways in which the Malian government reached out not only to the Soviet Union, but also to Cuba, there was a lot of cultural exchanges that went on back and forth. And so even though when I look at these posters, and I see, what my knowledge brings to them, my recognition of the African context of these images, that has absolutely nothing to do with what Jesus Fortrans or any of the people looking at these posters would not have any clue as to the information that I've just shared with you. And I don't think that's a problem, because I think they can speak to multiple audiences. As I said, the 1960s was a very powerful time in Africa, the time of reaching out. In Senegal, President Senghor hosted a huge festival in 1966 with thousands of artists, writers, performers, musicians that came to Senegal to celebrate this Pan-African moment. And I think Cuba was very much part of that. And as I said, the arts were very central to all of this. So. All right.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Frank. That was fascinating. And next we're going to hear from Professor Lee.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks everyone for coming here. Working on this exhibition has been a great opportunity for me to connect with the campus community and amazing visual images that surround the exciting world that we live in. The Cuban-Korean allyship was forged in 1960, mere months after the 1959 Cuban Revolution, and 13 years after North Korea, or Democratic People's Republic of Korea, was founded in 1948. As a side note, South Korea still does not have a diplomatic relationship with Cuba. So when I talk about Cuban-Korean connections, I mean North Korean connections. So throughout the global Cold War, this Cuban-Korean friendship has persisted under the principle of non-alignment, aligning with neither the First World, supported by the US, or the Second World, the Soviet bloc, or the socialist bloc. So the principle of being the third world, a non-aligned position, that was important for Cuba and North Korea. And for Cuba, it was often called as tricontinentalism, the solidarity with people of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the three continents. So growing out of this international politics and intergovernmental connections were a total of 11 known posters about North Korea that OSPAAAL produced. Except for the earliest two that you see on the screen, all of the 9 posters are on view in this gallery. So we see these 2 over there, one over here, as well as on that edge of the wall. The rainbow one is right there. This one, right over there. The one with eagle, I think over there, yeah. And the Korean Peninsula, right behind that gentleman with black hoodie. And then also the one about unification right there. So there are actually 3 of them in the back wall. So the first time I learned about OSPAAAL and Cuban-Korean connections was at an exhibition organized at the Interference Archive back in 2015. So you can see Gladys Acosta's 1968 poster in this exhibition installation shot. Based in Brooklyn, Interference Archive is an archive of printed matters and ephemeral objects gathered from a range of social movements. And this exhibition, Printing Solidarity, is produced in collaboration with other archive, Interference Archive. It's a major lender of these posters on view here. So for me, as a scholar of arts and visual cultures of both Koreas, both South Korea and North Korea, I was struck by these amazing works of North Korea-related visual culture produced in none other than Havana. The year 2015 was also a time when a new US-Cuban relationship was being envisioned beyond Cold War divisions. A direct flight between JFK and Havana had been installed just a few months prior. So a few weeks later, I was in Havana. On a bright sunny day in a quiet neighborhood, I passed a bust of Van Barca to enter the OSPAAAL office. Leftover posters were on sale for visitors like myself to purchase. The office ceiling was low. Che Guevara's images were big and everywhere, alongside other 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional works of art. Though at first there was only one person in the office in charge of what looked like a scant volume of sporadic sales at best, I asked if I could meet any artists. Hence, a picture with Rafael Enrique, designer of the last Korean-themed poster from 1983, which is hung over there. To me, the most striking poster is the one designed by Mario Sandoval. For the month of solidarity with Korea in 1968, so it's this poster. It includes a stylized image of the winged poor statue, or in Korean, Cheolima, encircled by a calligraphic text. So it says, 이제 침략자들은 남조선에서 당장 물러가라. American imperialist invaders leave South Korea at once! Exclamation point. Constructed in 1961 at the foot of the Mansudae Hill in Pyongyang, the statue is a symbol for a new period named by North Korean regime as the Winged Horse period, starting in 1956 or 1958, depending on who you ask. We now know, after Professor Barbara Frank's presentation, it is common to see OSPAAAL's graphic appropriation of reference images that expresses an uncomplicated aspiration for solidarity with the given nation, such as a poster with a portrait of Patrice Lumumba from Congo at the entrance wall over there, or a Southeast Asian Buddha statue for expressing a solidarity with Cambodia, which is not on view, unfortunately, in this exhibition. Sandoval's playful color scheme of orange-pink, lavender purple, and green, pastel green, is striking in its distinction from the more solemn choice of colors in North Korean propaganda posters that I am familiar with. Even while the reference of the winged horse signifies an acceptance, unwitting or not, of the North Korean regime's tendency to see history according to its emblematically christened mass campaigns such as the winged horse period followed by the socialist construction period. My preliminary research prepared for this conversation is twofold. First, I traced visual materials, mostly magazine cover art of the winged horse, Chalima. Chalima literally means thousand li horse, a mythical flying horse who travels 1,000 li or 2,500 miles per day. The mass campaign was to encourage all North Korean citizens, workers and farmers, to work beyond what may seem possible. Remember, this was merely several years after the Korean War, which broke in 1950 and lasted until 1953. For those 3 years, the entire northern half of the Korean peninsula was heavily bombed. Therefore, reconstruction was a top priority for the nation. And second, I looked at North Korean art magazines, which reported about the production of the bronze statue, the statue of Chalima, in 1961. So first, graphic visualization of Chalima between 1958 and 1960. At least over a dozen covers of various North Korean magazines portray the figure of flying horse as a symbol of nationwide reconstruction efforts. Some with slogans like, here, as you can see, 5-year plan before the 15th anniversary of August 15th, August 15th being the day of liberation from Japanese colonialism in 1945. It's always about projection towards the future. There's a speed, a sense of movement. The first photographic image of a Chalima statue appears in May 1960. On the cover of Joseon Misul, literally Korean art, the only art monthly in North Korea. As is reported in the magazine, this is a maquette, a scale model for the actual bronze statue was at the time under construction. As reported in the article, the sculptors were working very hard over the past year and a half. 11 revisions were made, a total of 100 sketches were created, numerous discussion sessions were taking place. Now more than 40 sculptors are working together. Riding the horse, a male worker holds a red letter from the party high up, while a female farmer sitting in the back holds a sheaf of rice. The statue is 11 meters or 36 feet high. Its length is 15 meters, almost 50 feet. Including the stone tower on which the statue is placed, the monument is altogether 28 meters or 92 feet high. Immediately, various North Korean magazines begin featuring drawings or photographic reproductions of the maquette. until the statue is finally complete in 1961. So as I make a comparison between the maquette and the poster, and the statue and the poster, the OSPAAAL poster, made in 1968, so 7 years after the statue was complete, seems to have cited an image of the statue, not the maquette. In North Korean magazine cover 2, images of the maquette no longer appear after 1961. The May 1961 issue of 조선미술 devotes a large portion of the discussion of the statue. So this entire portion of the table of contents actually says about the Cheolima statue. And we also see next to the table of contents Kim Il-sung, the first president of North Korea, visiting the sculptors to praise their good work. Just as a step-by-step process of the sculpture production is explained with documentary photographs, multiple articles illustrate dramatic stories of the challenges and how the sculptors successfully overcame those challenges. So the sculptor's hard work epitomized the spirit of winged horse campaign. For instance, to weld the horse's ears across the steel poles that surrounded the statue in the making required the heroic comrade An Sang-guk to bend his bodies to an extreme degree. So An later acquired a nickname of Mr. Acrobat. So this is all written in the article. The same issue of 조선미술 included a photograph of the statue from the back. And this is a more recent picture taken sometime before 2005. This one on the right side. The Cheolima statue still remains intact in Pyongyang. The significance that the regime gave to the mass campaign Cheolima was confirmed by the launching of a popular magazine of the same title. And in the spirit of exposing research process, just like Professor Barbara Frank has done, I would like to note that without the Library of Congress's recent digitization of North Korean serials, this talk would have included fewer interesting images. And the digital archive was made available only earlier this past year, 2021. And anyone can visit the library website. So like I said, the Cheolima statue still exists in Pyongyang. And these are, I'm going to show you some photographs from my own visit to Pyongyang in 2019. But as you can tell, I was not able to actually get to this view across the street to shoot at an angle that makes the statue as a monument look really big. Because the view that I was able to take was on a hill right next to it, Mansudae Hill, which is a famous tourist stop, and it was part of my group tour destination. And that is the Mansudae Hill, where two larger-than-life bronze statues of the two presidents, first presidents of North Korea, Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, are standing tall and flanked by bronze reliefs that spread like wings from the statues. So as you can see, like this is a real human person, right? It's a really big statue. The statue, when the left one of Kim Il-sung, when it was first built in 1972, it was 20 meters or 66 feet high. And his son, Kim Jong-il's statue, was added after Kim Jong-il's death in 2010. So what this means is that already by 1972, the 1961 Cheolima statue was overwhelmed by other bigger and taller bronze statues and public monuments, including the Kim Il-sung monument that you just saw, and the Juche Tower on the Taedong River, both constructed in 1972. By 1972, the Cheolima statue was no longer the only tall bronze statue or stone monument overlooking Pyongyang. In short, the 1968 poster is faithful to the monument culture of North Korea during the 1960s. And the monument culture of North Korea kept changing, it kept evolving as more monuments were added to the city of Pyongyang. So today I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share my preliminary research on the visual culture born out of the Cuban-Korean connections. I can also share with you that this is part of my larger project on North Korean art and cultural exchange with countries and peoples in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. So in a sense, it's my own tricontinental project, crossing national and regional borders. At least on OSPAAAL posters, I see myself developing further research in the direction of identifying other North Korean visual source material cited by OSPAAAL artists. So I only talked about one poster, right? There are 10 others. And comparing North Korean themed posters with the works by the same Cuban artists on other nations and regions. And one day, when I get a chance, I would like to bring the North Korean themed OSPAAAL posters to Pyongyang and ask Korean artists what they think of the Cuban representation of North Korea in terms of both design and printing techniques. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lee. So exciting to hear about your research. And I'd like to invite our last speaker, Professor Salcedo Watson. Afterwards, we will have a Q&A.
I was happily invited by Professor Lee and Professor Frank to join this conversation to present a bit of a technical standpoint. So I am a printmaker, and if any students here are familiar with digital media and printmaking, a lot of this might sound very familiar. So silkscreen. A lot of these, the early posters were made as silkscreens, and silkscreen is a stencil process, and I pulled out some images basically illustrating how simple it is. It is basically the college revolutionaries' preferred medium. Printmaking is meant to go out into the world, and all of these posters essentially do that. So silkscreen can be a hand technique, and you basically have a screen with a mesh, and you will block out any non-image information. What is open is what will accept the ink. A blob of ink is placed, a squeegee pulled, and then you end up with your printed image. And in this collection, there's two that we've identified as fresh silk screens, which is this one and that one in that back corner. And what distinguishes it, when you get up close, after our talk, you'll be able to see the physical nature, the physicality of the presence of the ink. And so basically, you will have one color, one stencil used for each area. So you can dissect images when you get up close to them, where you've got a base printing, and then, which would be that brick tone, and then the weapons would be printed over it, and you could physically see the oozy gooziness of the thick ink. And you've got a screen for each color, and the color information that is pertinent throughout the image will then appear on that screen. And this is an image that I found of posters being printed in Cuba. And it's really straightforward and fun, which is what made it the people's choice. Everybody can be doing this, and most of you probably own silkscreen t-shirts. Okay. You can basically have a rainbow roll, very popular in the 70s, where you would have ink placed in multi-locations and then be able to drag it across and have that integrated tone. So again, it's a stencil being pulled. Some of these could be hand-drawn. Some of them would be done with a photographic piece of film or a hand-drawn piece of film. And there are some images, when you look up close, like that one that's pixelated a little bit, that greenish one feels like it's a block print. And a lot of line work was very easily reproducible. So for printed media, just having black and white, very straightforward, very easy to copy. When you've got photographic imagery with continuous tone, that tone needed to be divided or broken up. And that's where halftone comes in. So you've got a solid image that would be screened to break it up or to pixelate it. So the halftone information makes it so that you don't immediately drop off from black to white or white to black. So images that have, when you get up close, that little bit of dot pixelation make it less bold. At the end, there's one that you can clearly see does not have the halftone breakup. So that's what allows you to have subtlety, breaking the pixelation. In terms of color, with a straightforward silk screen, you have a screen per color, and there could be a little piece of information overall, like the yellow would be everywhere that it's yellow, the black contours. When you get up close, you'll actually see that some of the colors pop through. They went from using silkscreen, which is somewhat precious. The nature of the ink looks like it would crack if you were to fold it. And a lot of these posters later on were meant to be distributed in the Tricontinental magazine, and they were foldable, and you needed to be able to print not hundreds, but thousands. And so the printing process needed to adapt to that. So this is a standard breakup of how you have colors that are used in printing. So some of you might be familiar with your red, yellow, blue. In the printing industry, you have yellow, cyan, and magenta. And you would use those with the possible addition of a black. So this is CMYK, and the K meaning the key. And the black, you would use it very cautiously. You don't just immediately throw black into it. And all of the colors, as they're layered, will create different saturations, different ranges of depth. So combining that with the concept of the halftone, in any printing, if you were to look at magazines with a magnifying glass, you will see little dots of each color. And the way that in printing was traditionally set up is that each color has an angle. So that you've got your yellow presence, your magenta presence, your cyan presence, and then you would determine how much of the black. And usually you would use very little bit of the black. And this is an image that is broken up in that manner. So this is super magnified, and when you basically step back, it all becomes cohesive. Not unlike what you were looking at with Impressionist artists, where you've got that dot formation that is super visible at a distance, and then as you get up closer, it pixelates or separates. This is in a super nutshell, okay? So now we have offset printing, which was another technique that was used in order to make mass production a lot more fluid. But they had the simplicity and the elegance of designs where you had a cohesive background, you had the OSPAAAL signature, that logo in the back, and then you had the cultural imagery depending on where the poster was directed to, which of the cause they were trying to support. So you have the African imagery, you have the North Korean imagery, you've got the Latin American, and you have basically armed resistance, and you've got culture, and culture being at the heart of the soul of each nation. That was prominent. So reaching back art historically into long-range historical iconography, that was inserted. Then you've got the weapons that could be applicable to Africa, to Latin America, and other revolutions. And then you've got kind of a formula, a design formula. Now, a lot of these poster makers were designers. They had a background in graphic design. So this wasn't arbitrary. These are really tight and slick. And some of the simplicity had everything to do with the fact that they were going to be made into silk screens. So you didn't want to make it too complicated. Offset opened up the possibility to have photographic images produced without so much handwork. And depending on how much was available, it varied in the complexity. So if you were physically to just come up close to these and have a look, you won't see the presence of the ink. It'll be very integrated. The amount of ink placed on these sheets of paper is minimal compared to what you would physically drag across with a screen. This is a flatbed offset press. And the way that offset works is that there's no direct printing. So you would have, ink rollers would happen over here. You've got a dampening system. And then you've got a bed where the plate exists. So it's no longer a silk screen, now it's a lithograph. All of this information that would have been transferred onto a silk screen is now burned onto a photographic lithographic plate. adhere to this, the same techniques of lithography, oil and water resisting each other. I don't want to lose anybody, but oil and water resist each other. And then you have a little layer of water going across. So offset basically means you're not directly printing off of the plate the way that we do upstairs. You're not just kissing it off. You are transferring that image onto a rubber blanket, which is that blue thing. And the beauty of that is if you've got half-tone dots there, you've got a really controlled amount of ink running in the fountain, which is actually on the other side. You could super, super tightly control how much ink is there. Run across, the rollers ink the plate, with the dampening system built in, come back, pull down, take away the image on the blanket, and then you kiss it down onto the paper. And you can control the registration very acutely. So when you look at these posters and you're like, oh my goodness, how did they get tight text, clean, clear, next to each other, that color? This is registration that involves like hairlines, like literally one hair distance up, down, sideways. So when you see a little bit of a buzz where the colors aren't aligning, that's about registration being just a little bit off. Moisture in the room is enough to throw the registration off. So that's a flatbed press. This would be a hand crank. And I worked as a printmaker, and I brought my class to a printmaking workshop where we had an offset press, and this was my former employer giving a demonstration. So this is hand cranked, and it can be machine cranked, but when you're proofing, you want to really have the control, so he's cranking it over, and this would be where the paper is. So that was the press, but I wanted to give you a sense of the scale of it, and the blanket, being rubber, is very gentle. So you're not really putting any friction against the plate, because you're just kissing down, bouncing into it, and you can adjust it and just put it on auto, and you're printing hundreds. And you just like add ink like a little blob, and all of these rollers, you have so many rollers that are distributing. Okay, and this is another look at what it looks like. So this would be a plate, and that would be the blanket. So with larger machinery, not the flatbed press, you've got rotary presses. Instead of having the plate sitting on a bed, it's attached to a cylinder. So it's really cylinder, cylinder, paper inserted, kiss it off, and it's just like the hand is no longer present, because what happened with what we're discussing is all of this distribution really had to get kicked up a notch. So this hand printing in a simple room went large. So that's where the offset went through. So that is the end of my slides. There's more here.
So we're going to do Q&A now, but before we do Q&A and some of you run out, I just want to plug in some extra events happening this month related to the exhibition. So we do have a Zoom lecture with some folks from the Interference Archive, which again is one of the major lenders of the exhibition and also collaborator. That's Thursday, February 10th from 2:30 to 4 p.m. And then there's also going to be a panel discussion here at Stony Brook on February 23rd. It's about Stony Brook and the global 60s, so we'll be hearing from people that were on campus in the 60s and the types of activism and protest culture that they encountered, and that's from 4 to 7 p.m. So now, Q&A, I would just ask you raise your hand if you have questions, and please speak loudly so that our panelists can hear.
Well, so we could definitely wait for the questions to come in, but I just want to share how excited I was to get connected with your world of African art history and the world of objects, and also how thrilled I was to know that somewhere in the world it's actually easy to identify the visual references that are made in these posters. It's just that there probably will be no singular individual who has all the information of all the visual references that are made by approximately, I think now we know 30 to 40 designers who were working for OSPAAAL, because they were drawing from multiple sources. And I was so excited also to learn more about what they actually did to transfer the source images to these amazing posters. So I just wanted to thank you both and also congratulate all of us for digging some new information about these posters. The posters have been discussed mainly in terms of the intentions and aspirations of artists that rhyme with the Cuban government's tricontinental policy. Or how these posters were circulating as part of the magazine's Tricontinental. Yeah, I think art history has a lot to offer to this exciting chapter of world history.
Hi, thanks everyone for your presentations. That was so fantastic. I wondered if you, it was so great to hear both of you, Dr. Frank and Dr. Lee, talk about the source context of the objects that were cited, but I wonder if you could talk a bit about how you interpret their use in this citational form within the posters themselves, like what you might imagine would lead an artist to pick these objects, or what the use of these particular objects in the posters does for us all.
So I can say something about, I kind of, mentioned this really heady time of the 60s, and negritude, which was a cultural policy promoted by Senghor out of Senegal, to celebrate blackness not just in Senegal, but across sub-Saharan Africa, across the Atlantic to Cuba and elsewhere. The sort of Pan-African, that 1966 festival that took place in Senegal, over the next 10 years, there were a whole series of these Pan-African festivals, and there was that on the one hand had nothing to do with the Soviet Union and the United States, although both the Soviet Union and the United States realized that this was huge, what was going on in sub-Saharan, in the Atlantic world, in the global South. And they both recognized that they needed to be positioned to be part of that. And so the Soviet Union sent artists and musicians. I showed you the picture of Duke Ellington playing in Senegal. And so it was really seen as critical to be part of this conversation. And on the one hand, as I said, I look at these posters and I see the African image because that's what I'm familiar with. And I'm trying to imagine what Jesus Fortrans was doing. Did he have access to this actual book? Well, I think he probably did. And these exhibitions of African art, traditional classical African art, as well as contemporary artists, musicians, the kind of exchanges that went on. I told Professor Lee that one of my colleagues remembers going into the office of it was the Institute of Human Sciences, which was one of the main research, it still is to this day, one of the main research centers in Bamako in Mali. And whenever I've done research there, even though my own home is an institutional connection is the museum, it has been for decades. My closest colleagues are actually at this Institute of Human Sciences. And this colleague of mine remembers going into one of the offices and speaking to the director, hoping to get the stamp of approval on her research clearance. And the first thing she went in, and there was a big poster of Che Guevara on the wall, And Che! Yeah. So, all right, no problem, I'll stamp your paperwork. And this would have been, in the 1980s. The kind of, I think we tend to forget about the kind of, the richness of the connections that were taking place that really had nothing to do with the United States or the Soviet Union. So, and as I said, I can sort of imagine this artist flipping through this book. And it didn't really matter whether he could read French or not. It didn't matter whether he knew what these things were. He chose that image. One thing I didn't mention is that when I first looked at that image, I thought that the artist had played a little bit fast and loose with the arm. It's kind of an awkward posture. And I would say 90% of ballet sculpture, the arms are flat against the body, pressed against the body. And I thought, this is really odd, until I saw the actual source, which was the arm was moved away from the body. And so it, he must have been flipping through that book and saw, this is great, just stick a Kalashnikov right in there, and it works really well. He didn't have to change the image at all. So
The arm was already lost.
that's right.
Yeah.
So that's why I was so interested in hearing about how, it wasn't an artist who was looking at a picture and then drawing something. There was a photographic transfer that had to take place, and then it was manipulated.
Right.
Right.
Right, yeah. It depends on what technology was available. Taking the photograph, enlarging it, and a lot of the earlier processes involved a darkroom process camera, projecting onto a piece of film and controlling what size, the way that you would make a photographic enlargement, and then using it for your purposes. So yeah, they didn't worry about copyright infringement or anything, but I need that. And then,
I mean, the other thing I'll mention is that Cote d'Ivoire is probably 4,000 miles, 4,500 miles away from Zimbabwe.
Yet, using Cote d'Ivoire image.
Yeah, this is a poster in celebration of Zimbabwe. Now, the other thing, I mentioned this to a colleague, and they were like, 1969, Zimbabwe as a country did not exist then. It was Rhodesia, which is true, except that where did they get the name Zimbabwe? Well, it was some nationalist groups at the early part of the 1960s that celebrated that name Zimbabwe, that comes out of an indigenous term for these fabulous stone ruins that are in the country. And so the country of Zimbabwe did not yet exist, but political groups in what was then Rhodesia did exist. So
Yeah, this is a really interesting and important point that, nothing I would assume North Korean regime didn't allow would have left North Korea to arrive in Cuba. So there's definitely intergovernmental collaboration. But I think with the Zimbabwe, I think it's below and above national level of collaboration, or expression of solidarity. So I think that's really fascinating. Even to look at Cuban history of tricontinental solidarity as an agenda of the Cuban regime, and in expressing aspiration for global solidarity. In fact, on the national level, the racial, ethnic diversity within Cuba was not highlighted as part of the Cuban regime's agenda. So oftentimes, local population suffered, despite of the global kind of manifestation of world solidarity. Something that I can say a little bit about North Korean themed posters is that when I think only the 60s posters, so from 68, 69, they have explicit citations of North Korea-made visual materials, either photographs or maybe in that case, at the end of that wall, second to the edge of the wall, posters. A poster from North Korea was probably made into a poster. So I'm interested in locating these visual sources, whereas starting from the 70s, a lot of the design was, I think, done in-house at OSPAAAL. So everything was kind of created new. So you can actually see Rafael Enrique's 83 poster about Korean unification. I think that entire thing was made in Cuba rather than citing a North Korean origin image. And the types of images that were incorporated are, again, very diverse. A photograph, or it could be a poster, it could be, I don't know, like I need to locate the exact, calligraphic writing of the writing encircling the wings horse statue. That's something to look farther for.
thank you so much for your thoughts. It's really astonishing to see the exhibition today, especially because I see the expressions of intolerance in there. Subject matters starting with ethnicity, race, language, the class, understand the solidarity. They say is not actually around the socialist ideology. It goes beyond. So I kind of wonder, how Cuba became the agent or actor that promoted actually use these visual representations within the alliance, non-alliance actually movement, because as far as I understand, this non-alliance movement started with the alliance, non-alliance actually, alliance, yeah, as non-alliance, right, between Asia and Africa, and in 1950s, and got expanded to South American countries in 60s. Cuba joined that in 1961, and immediately became an active sort of member in the non-alliance movement. So my first question is if you have any idea how Cuba actually became a leading state in embracing the idea of non-alliance in this way. And my second question is how these posters were used by OSPAAAL. OSPAAAL created them, and these are just so amazing kind of visual presentations. How do they use them? Do they use them domestically for their own internal purposes, or they send them out and distribute it to the member states?
Well, maybe, sorry, I might have to answer this question very quickly. OSPAAAL, as Organization of Solidarity of People of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, was founded on the heels of the Second Tricontinental Conference in 1966, which was held in Havana. It was actually scheduled to be held, I think, in Morocco or Egypt, somewhere else, but the assassination of Mbarka changed everything, the dynamics between these allied nations. And even though even though OSPAAAL considered itself as an international organization, except for one artist, everyone was Cuban. So that's something to make note of. And these posters were supposed to be folded the way that we actually are showing in one of the really fun printed objects, and then put in Tricontinental magazine to be circulated across the world. But the history of circulation and reception actually does not have data, as far as I know, which countries or who actually received it. So that remains to be researched by all of us, or some of us.
And if you look at the bottoms of some of these posters, you'll see 4 different languages, right? English, French, Spanish, and Arabic. The same thing said, celebrating the Day of Solidarity with Congo, whatever it is. So these were really intended to reach an external audience.
Yeah, so I actually haven't seen Tricontinental, the actual magazine, all written in Arabic, but English, Spanish, French were the major languages in which the magazines were produced. And sometimes Arabic was introduced, but I don't think it was ever produced in Korean, relatively minor language.
In the back.
For present day, revolution and whatnot, are we still seeing the traditional printmaking techniques used, or is it more digital now, since that's a easier, quicker way to produce images? I don't know if you would know.
Lorena, would you have a?
Can you repeat your question? Are
Yeah,
we still
so
seeing?
in present day countries that are having revolutions and creating these images, are they still using silkscreen and offset presses and stuff, or do you think they're using more digital images and printing from a digital creation?
I would imagine both.
Yeah.
Definitely everything is moving so much more quickly with digital technology, and yeah, there's some countries that don't even have post offices anymore. Like Guatemala does not have an active post office. So you've got a lot of international issues, and the poster printed media is kind of snail mail by comparison to where we are now. So my gut feeling is yes, maybe, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, let's say you start a revolution tomorrow, and then you use both digital and silkscreen technique. There you go. You're using both. I mean, but the aesthetics of real print, you know, it could be also transferred to digital platform, and then recall the memory of social movements of the earlier decades of the 20th century.
I think with Photoshop, and just literally being able to find so much imagery easily accessible, it never really needs to be printed out and come to fruition. Those design schemes and the dynamism, the iconography, the motifs can be layered and then transmitted electronically. So the physical object has changed in value for that transmission. I think a lot of times, even you know, within our university, you realize projects that remain virtual, that they don't actually become a physical manifestation of what they might have meant to be. So yeah, the tactility of the print is beautiful and tangible and archival in ways that are changing like right now. So just looking at what offset printing looked like when I was familiar with it, like technically, we're light years away, because there's so much that's literally done from another place, from a computer, and as far as like the press person, it's a different story now. So yeah, so much of it is literally virtual.
But I think your question is touching upon a very important historical aspect of OSPAAAL, which is that at that time, the fastest, cheapest, most efficient way of reaching everyone across the world was through magazine subscription. At some point, the subscription was upwards of 100,000. So, and then each magazine had supposedly included a poster. And some gather that maybe posters were actually more popular because they look amazing than the actual magazines. And the magazines themselves actually included very dry articles about the news of revolutions and movements across the world.
I think with that, having a poster, like most of you probably have art on your walls, and posters are inexpensive and accessible. Silkscreen posters, original ones, are a little bit more precious than the offset, both by their production and their numbers. So when you think of how many are in an edition, if you've got 100,000, that's not a limited edition, but if you've got 100, that changes the value of it. So you start treating it like an art object, and you live with it. You live with the message. You see Che Guevara, who still represents what he represented then, and to many degrees, that revolutionary spirit, whether or not you're fully immersed in knowing the history, you know what that stood for. That's iconography that has survived. So having tangible work that individuals live with, then going back to research, like what did this mean? The fact that we may not have the artifact changes the conversation a lot. So yeah.
So I actually have a question for you, Sohl, in connection with this. Do you have a sense, I mean, there's all these posters came from this archive in Brooklyn. Do you have a sense how exceptional that is, that archive? Or, I mean, I know that when I was looking for some of the images, and I resorted to Google Image, things that would come up included eBay and sales of reproduction posters. And I just didn't know how rare are these?
Yeah. So, of course, I cannot have a definite answer, but what I can say is that Lincoln Cushing, who actually came to Stony Brook via Zoom to give us a lecture on OSPAAAL posters and Cuban posters more generally in the fall of 2021, was the one in the 90s who pioneered archiving OSPAAAL posters. So the reason why he launched that project and made it his own is because when he was frequently visiting Cuba from the 80s, OSPAAAL itself did not have an archive of its posters. So he thought it was tragic. So he gathered posters not only within Cuba, but also in the US. And what I know about the Interference Archive collection, called OSPAAAL's collection, it actually came from one person, mostly from one person, who collected OSPAAAL posters over the years by going back and forth between Cuba and the US. I know at least a few other collections exist in the US of the OSPAAAL posters, one in California certainly. But another anecdote that I can share is that Jane Norling, who was a California-based activist, graphic designer, who went to Cuba to spend a few months at OSPAAAL, and then made a poster about Puerto Rico. When she went back to OSPAAAL, I forget which year, they didn't have one of the posters that she made, copies of the Puerto Rico poster that she made. So she was the only one having the original posters back in California. So the posters were not treated as precious artworks to be preserved and conserved and exhibited. They were made to be distributed, right, and be used however they wanted. So a lot of Black Panther's images were riffed by OSPAAAL, OSPAAAL's images riffing Black Panther. Emory Douglas's images were coming back to the US. So there are a lot of exchange, and within it, the materials might have survived.
Daniel?
I have a question about this term visual citation, and I really like how you were just saying, Dr. Lee, riffing. I would imagine a lot of students would hear citation and think about the practice of, pointing to the source in that scholarly kind of way. And I like how Dr. Frank, you pointed out that it really isn't a problem for what's trying to be conveyed artistically and visually. And so I'm wondering, for somebody who might start a revolution tomorrow and use different techniques, do you think this kind of loose visual citation would still work today? Or is this sort of like a historical moment in the way they're using their citational practice?
Well, you notice none of us use the word appropriation, right? I gave a paper at a conference about 15 years ago, and I intentionally used the word appropriation, and I was talking about contemporary African artists who appropriated traditional techniques, and so for example, mud cloth, my scarf is one of those things that the original source is this women's tradition that is very specific to a particular place and time, and it is now global, right? There's other examples of this. And I intentionally use the word appropriation because there's an element of agency to it, and actively choosing something for whatever reason. And so again, trying to put myself in the mindset of Jesus Fortrans, who's wanting to celebrate. I mean, he's never been to Africa. He's never, we don't know. Okay,
Yeah.
he probably hasn't been.
Yes.
Maybe he went to Dakar. I mean, there were artists exchange. I mean, it's possible,
Yeah.
but let's imagine that he hasn't been. And so, but he's as a graphic designer, we don't know what his own political views were, or how important that was. But to have this big, massive book on African art to select something from, and to see how it worked visually for what he wanted to say. Again, I don't think it really mattered to him, whether it was accurate to Zimbabwe. So I don't know. And again, I use that word appropriation, which has a kind of a negative aspect to it. It's like that's a bad word to appropriate something. But I used it intentionally because it is an active word. And citation, you're right, citation sounds a little bit more erudite and scholarly. But I actually like the idea of visual citations. That I like that term too. So.
The one thing with the concept of appropriation, you've got something like you've got a cultural artifact. And I remember hearing about Prince Harry would be doing Aboriginal painting, and they said cease and desist. You have no business doing that because this has a cultural value. But appropriating another artist's work, as long as you give credit where credit is due, which I think Lincoln Cushing mentioned, that as long as when they're riffing, if they can go ahead back to the original source and identify that artist, because among the Cuban designers, there were names, and they basically put their name on the work, which was kind of novel in that regime, that it was not, they welcomed that highlighting of the individual artist as a creative person. But with the conversation, I think it was Lincoln Cushing that talked about Shepard Fairey appropriating an image. And they said, excuse me, Mr. Fairey, you really need to go step back a little bit and give credit where you got that from because you're doing mighty fine. And they are forgotten, but this was their original design work, their unique personal creative work that you can't just help yourself to without acknowledging it. So I think it'll be a little bit different when you're talking about individual human beings that are creative versus artifacts that are centuries old, that are a legacy to a culture, which with the Aboriginal reference, that's something that, the imperial colonialist powers have no business touching that. You don't get to touch that. You don't get to discuss it. It's not your business. It's literally personal, cultural.
Well, so for example, if I do end up tracking down the designer of the North Korean original poster, and then put the designer artist in the same room as the Cuban artist, Cuban designer, I wonder what kind of conversation they might have. But I think, at least in terms of our historical term of appropriation, we have established in our history it is one entity taking advantage of the other, exploiting, extracting resources, part of the imperialist colonial agenda. And in the case of the Cuban artists, they were probably paid by the state, but the subscription fee for the magazines was very minimal. In fact, Cuba had the policy of respecting no copyrights. So basically anyone could just copy these posters and print them. There's no copyrights for these designs. There's no copyrights for the Tricontinental articles. Everything was open for anyone to grab and use. And Cuban artists were doing the same thing. But who knows if North Korean artists would agree to that.
Okay, I think that's it. And just wanted to thank everyone, our speakers, Karen and Georgia for hosting this amazing event at Zuccaire. And thank you all for coming, and please do come to our other events this month. Thank you.